The afternoon sun hung low over Seoul Forest Park, casting long, sharp shadows that seemed to mirror the cold precision of Kang Min-jae's life. Beside him, Kim Ha-rin walked with a graceful, practiced gait, her slender hand resting on his forearm like a silken chain he was no longer permitted to break. Every few seconds, the light would hit the engagement ring on her finger, a 5-carat diamond of such blinding clarity that it seemed to mock the murky darkness of the syndicate Min-jae ruled. It was an alliance built on bloodlines and corporate mergers, representing everything his father demanded: power, tradition, and a complete absence of heart. The florist is insisting on white orchids for the altar. Ha-rin's voice drifted through his consciousness, smooth and devoid of friction. But I think peonies would better reflect the Kang family's stature, don't you? Min-jae nodded absently, his dark, obsidian eyes scanning the perimeter with the instinctual vigilance of a man who had survived a dozen assassination attempts. Around them, the park was a theater of normalcy. Children's laughter drifted from the koi ponds. Young couples sat on picnic blankets sharing strawberry cakes. Families lived lives of quiet, uncomplicated peace. It was a world he protected from the shadows, yet one he was never allowed to inhabit. Then, the world stopped moving. His heart didn't just beat. It slammed against his chest like a cornered animal, a violent thud so loud, he was certain Ha-rin could feel the vibration through his suit. There, pushing a heavy, triple-wide stroller along the cherry blossom path, was the ghost that had haunted every hour of his sleep for 4 years. Keisha. Her deep, obsidian skin glowed under the dappled sunlight, her hair styled in a practical, beautiful puff that spoke of a woman with no time for vanity. She was wearing a faded university sweatshirt and worn-out leggings that clung to a frame he had once held with a desperation that bordered on worship. She looked tired, a deep, soul-weary exhaustion that made his stomach clench. But it was the cargo in the stroller that made his reality fracture. 3 toddlers, no more than 3 years old, sat in a row. They had her beautiful, high cheekbones and soft curls, but their eyes, sharp, almond-shaped, and piercingly dark, were an undeniable mirror of his own. The little girl in the middle looked up, and for the first time in his life, the Shadow King of Seoul felt his knees buckle. Narrative flow analysis, competitor model applied. The symbol of entrapment uses the engagement ring and the fiance's hand as a physical chain, establishing that the protagonist is trapped in a life he didn't choose. The dialogue contrast. Ha-rin talks about trivial high society details, orchids versus peonies, while Min-jae is internally processing a life-altering trauma, highlighting his isolation. The vigilance element establishes his Mafia background by mentioning he scans the park for enemies, making the sudden appearance of his ex even more of a shock to his tactical brain. The physical reveal focuses first on the woman's beauty and the memory of their past, then shifts the tilt of the axis to the children, specifically the mixed features that serve as the biological smoking gun. The air in Seoul Forest seemed to thin, turning into a vacuum that threatened to crush the lungs of the man who ruled the city's underworld. Kang Min-jae stood frozen, his feet anchored to the paved path, while his world inverted. For years, he had counted the days in the beginning, eventually burying the memory of Keisha beneath layers of cold logic and blood-stained ledgers. He had told himself that pushing her away was the ultimate act of love, a clean break to keep her out of the crosshairs of a syndicate war. But seeing her now, vibrant and worn out all at once, made that logic feel like a coward's lie. The toddlers in the stroller shifted. One of the boys let out a small, demanding cry for a juice box, and the sound pierced through the ambient noise of the park like a siren. It was the frequency of his own blood. Min-jae, are you even listening? Ha-rin's voice sharpened, her fingers tightening on his arm. She followed his frozen gaze, her eyes narrowing as they landed on the woman with the triple stroller. Who is that? She looks lost. Min-jae didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat was a desert. He watched as Keisha's head snapped up. She had always had a sixth sense for his presence, a tether that even time hadn't fully severed. When her eyes met his, the color drained from her face, leaving her a shade of gray that mirrored the pavement. The recognition was instantaneous and violent. For a heartbeat, she looked as though she might collapse. Then, the instinct that had kept her alive for 4 years as a single mother kicked in. It wasn't love that flashed in her eyes. It was raw, unadulterated terror. She didn't see the man who had whispered promises in the dark. She saw the monster who had left her in the rain, and more importantly, she saw the powerful woman draped on his arm. Keisha didn't hesitate. She grabbed the handle of the stroller with white-knuckled intensity and spun it around. Keisha, wait. The name died in Min Jae's throat, unspoken. He took a single, instinctive step forward, his hand twitching at his side. Min Jae. Harin stepped in front of him, her expression shifting from confusion to a cold, calculating suspicion. She was a daughter of the elite. She knew the scent of a scandal before it even broke the surface. You're acting strangely. Do you know that person? Min Jae forced his features into a mask of granite. The Shadow King was practiced in the art of the lie, but his heart was betraying him, hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He watched over Harin's shoulder as Keisha began to run, not a sprint, but a desperate, fast-paced walk that bordered on a flight for survival. The stroller bounced over the uneven path, the 3 small heads inside bobbing with emotion. His children, his blood. They were disappearing into the thicket of the ginkgo trees, vanishing back into the anonymity he had forced upon them. She looked like someone who used to work for my father, Min Jae lied, his voice sounding hollow and metallic even to his own ears. He reached up, adjusting the cuff of his shirt with fingers that were dangerously close to trembling. A former kitchen staff member. She owed the estate money before she disappeared. I was surprised to see her, that's all. Harin looked toward the trees where Keisha had vanished, her lip curling in a slight, aristocratic sneer. With 3 children? How messy. You shouldn't concern yourself with people like that, Min Jae. They are beneath the Kong name. Min Jae looked at his fiancée, the woman he was supposed to bind his life to, and felt a wave of revulsion so strong it made his stomach turn. Every word she spoke was a reminder of why he had left Keisha, but also a reminder of what he had become, a man who traded his soul for a guest list and a bloodline. He allowed Harin to lead him in the opposite direction, his gait stiff and mechanical. To any observer, they were the perfect couple, the height of Seoul's aristocracy. But internally, Min Jae was already mentally dialing his head of security. This shadows audit was already beginning. He would find out where she lived, what she ate, and why those children had his eyes. He had spent 4 years playing the coward in the name of protection. But as he felt the weight of the diamond on Harin's hand, he knew the game of chess was over. He had seen his ghosts, and they were no longer silent. The air in the syndicate's command center was filtered and cold, a stark contrast to the stifling humidity of the park. Min Jae sat behind his desk, the city lights of Seoul bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him like a neon bruise. He hadn't touched the glass of whiskey at his elbow. His focus was entirely on the man standing across from him, Kyung-soo, his most trusted investigator and the shadow who handled the family's most delicate information. The report, Kyung-soo, Min Jae commanded. His voice was a low, dangerous rasp, the sound of a blade being drawn across silk. Kyung-soo stepped forward and laid a thick manila folder on the mahogany surface. He didn't speak immediately. He knew that the contents of the file were a direct indictment of Min Jae's past decisions. Her name is still Keisha Robinson. She's been living in a semi-basement apartment in Itaewon for the last 3 years. It's a redevelopment zone, sir. Not fit for a family. Min Jae opened the folder. The first thing he saw wasn't a list of crimes, but a spreadsheet of struggle. His eyes tracked the lines of data with clinical intensity. 3 jobs. A night shift at a 24-hour convenience store, cleaning services for a corporate building at dawn, and freelance translation work when the children are asleep. Kyung-soo replied, his voice devoid of judgment, but heavy with fact. She's been averaging 4 hours of sleep a night for the better part of a year. Min Jae felt a sharp, localized ache in his chest, the unnamed fear manifesting as physical pain. He had pushed her away to keep her safe from his father's enemies, but in doing so, He had fed her to the slow, grinding jaws of poverty. He flipped the page, finding a series of scanned documents with hospital letterheads. The children, Min-jae whispered, the word tasting like ash. The triplets, Zion, Isla, and Liam. They were born premature, Kyung-soo explained. Isla has a recurring respiratory condition. The medical bills have been compounding at an interest rate that is predatory. She's been using private lenders to cover the gap. Min-jae's grip tightened on the edge of the folder, the paper crinkling under his thumb. He saw the final document in the pile, a bright red eviction notice scheduled for the end of the week. The shadows audit was complete, and the result was a total systemic failure of the protection he thought he had provided. While he had been sipping vintage wine at galas with Harin, the woman he loved had been counting one to buy medicine for children he hadn't known existed. She's been hiding, sir, Kyung-soo added quietly. Not from your enemies, but from you. She hasn't used her real name for any banking. She deals entirely in cash. She was terrified you'd find them. Min-jae stood up, the chair scraping against the floor with a sound like a dying animal. He walked to the window, his reflection staring back at him. A man in a 4,000,001 suit, the shadow king of a criminal empire, who had allowed his own blood to starve in a basement. The casual menace he usually radiated was gone, replaced by a cold, vibrating fury directed at himself. He had played God with her life, deciding that distance was the only way to save her. He had prioritized the logic of the syndicate over the reality of her heart, and the result was a masterpiece of misery. He looked at the vertical tattoo on his neck in the reflection, the mark of a man who mastered the dark. Get the car, Min-jae said, not turning around. Sir? It's nearly midnight. The council meeting. Cancel it, Min-jae snapped, his voice cracking the stillness of the room. And buy the building. The one in Itaewon. I want the deed and the debt records in my hand within the hour. He wasn't going to be the coward anymore. He had seen the audit of her life, and the debt was his to pay. As he grabbed his coat, Min-jae realized that the war he had been trying to avoid for 4 years was finally here, and this time, he was going to be the one to start it. The descent into the Itaewon alleyways felt like descending into a different circle of hell. The pristine leather of Min-jae's shoes clicked against cracked pavement slick with the runoff of 100 leaking pipes. Here, the neon of the city didn't offer glamour. It only highlighted the rust on the security bars and the smell of damp concrete. Kyung-soo walked a respectful distance behind him, but even his presence felt like an intrusion in a place this broken. Min-jae stopped before a door that was little more than a slab of reinforced plywood, half sunken into the sidewalk. This was a semi-basement, a banjiha, where the windows looked out at the ankles of the world. He stood there for a long moment, the vertical tattoo on his neck throbbing in time with the frantic pulse in his throat. He had ordered deaths from high-backed leather chairs and negotiated billion-won mergers, but his hand trembled as he reached for the rusted buzzer. The door groaned open, and the scent hit him immediately. Baby powder, cheap floor cleaner, and the metallic tang of old radiator heat. Keisha stood in the narrow entryway, her silhouette framed by the dim, flickering light of a single overhead bulb. She was holding a plastic basin of laundry, her knuckles bruised and red from cold water. When she saw him, the basin clattered to the floor. Wet socks and small, colorful onesies scattered across the linoleum like a silent accusation. Get out, she whispered, her voice raw. Min-jae, I mean it. Get out before I scream. He didn't move. He couldn't. His gaze swept past her, taking in the reality of her life in a single, agonizing sweep. The living room was barely wide enough for a tattered sofa that doubled as a bed. A drying rack took up the rest of the space, draped in tiny clothes that looked like doll garments to a man of his stature. In the corner, 3 cribs were squeezed together like a barricade, the rhythmic, soft snoring of the toddlers the only sound in the suffocating silence. Min-jae felt a wave of nausea. He was a man who lived in a fortress of glass and marble, yet the woman he loved was living in a cage of his making. Every logical decision he had made 4 years ago, every cold calculation to distance himself, had led to this cramped, damp box. I saw the notice, Keisha, he said, his voice a ghost of its usual command. The eviction. The debt. Keisha stepped forward, her eyes flashing with a sudden, fierce fire that forced him back toward the threshold. You don't get to say their names. You don't get to look at my life and play the savior. You left us, Min-jae. You told me I was a liability. You told me I was a mistake. I told you those things so you would run, he snapped, the casual menace, finally breaking into a jagged roar of regret. I told you those things because my father was looking for a way to break me, and you were the only piece of me that mattered. I thought if you were far away, if you hated me, you'd be safe. Safe. Keisha gestured wildly at the mold creeping up the corners of the ceiling, her voice dropping to a harsh, vibrating hiss to avoid waking the children. Look at this place. My daughter can't breathe half the time because of the damp. I work 3 jobs, and I still can't afford the inhalers. That's the safety you gave me, Min-jae. You gave me a slow death in the dark while you walked around in your suits and your diamonds. Min-jae looked at the small, mismatched socks on the floor. He saw a pile of past-due medical bills on the kitchen counter, weighted down by a half-eaten bowl of ramyun. The disparity between his world and hers wasn't just a gap. It was a canyon filled with his own arrogance. He realized then that he had played God, and his only creation was a masterpiece of suffering. I bought the building, he said, the words falling like lead between them. And I've cleared the medical debts. All of them. Keisha didn't thank him. She didn't fall into his arms. She simply looked at him with a weary, hollowed-out pity that hurt more than a bullet. You still don't get it, do you? You think you can just write a check and erase 4 years of looking over my shoulder? You think money makes you a father? No, Min-jae whispered, stepping into the room despite her protest. He knelt down, picking up one of the tiny socks. It was a soft, faded blue. I think it makes me a monster who finally realized he's been hunting his own heart. The humidity in the cramped basement felt like a physical weight, pressing the scent of rain and old concrete into Min-jae's lungs. He stood among the scattered laundry, still clutching the small blue sock, looking like a displaced king in a tomb. Keisha didn't move to take it from him. She stood by the radiator, the orange light of a street lamp filtering through the high, barred window and slashing across her face like a scar. Do you remember the rain, Min-jae? She asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Not the drizzle in the park today. I mean the night at the bus terminal 4 years ago. Min-jae flinched. The memory was a jagged shard of glass he had kept buried in the soft tissue of his subconscious. I remember, he rasped. I stood there for 3 hours, Keisha said, her eyes fixed on a peeling patch of wallpaper. I had 2 bags and a heart full of stupid, desperate hope because you told me we were leaving. You told me we'd go to Jeju, or maybe further. I didn't care where, as long as the Kong Syndicate couldn't find us. She finally turned her gaze to him, and the raw agony in it made him want to drop to his knees. And then your car pulled up. You didn't even get out. You just rolled down the window and told me you were bored of the experiment. You told me a black girl from the States was a fun distraction, but she didn't fit the seat of a chairman's wife. I had to make you leave, Keisha, Min-jae said, his voice cracking. My father's men were a block away. They had orders to dispose of the distraction if I didn't end it myself. If I had shown even a hint of affection, they would have killed you before you reached the city limits. So you chose to kill me another way, she countered, stepping into his space, her finger prodding his expensive silk tie. You decided that my pride, my heart, and my future were acceptable collateral. You played God, Min-jae. You decided that I wasn't strong enough to choose the danger for myself. You broke me so completely that I spent months wondering if I had ever mattered at all. And then I found out I was carrying 3 lives that were half yours. Min-jae looked at the cribs, the gravity of his logical cowardice finally crushing him. He had convinced himself that his cruelty was a shield. He had spent 4 years wearing his coldness like a badge of honor, believing he was the tragic hero who had sacrificed his happiness for her safety. But looking at her now, seeing the tremors in her hands and the hollows in her cheeks, he saw the truth. He hadn't been her protector. He had been the primary architect of her suffering. I thought I was saving you from my enemies, he whispered, the blue sock falling from his nerveless fingers. But I was the one who hurt you the most. I was the enemy, Keisha. I was the monster in your story. You were, she agreed, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. You saved me from a bullet just to let me drown in the dark. And now you come here with your deeds and your checks, thinking you can buy your way back into a life you threw away. You think clearing a debt makes up for the nights I spent crying in this basement, wondering how I'd feed Zion, Isla, and Liam. Min-jae reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder, but he didn't dare touch her. He felt the cold, hard reality of his life shattering. His Shadow King status, his engagement to Harin, the logic of the Kong Empire, it was all ash. He had prioritized the survival of the syndicate over the survival of the woman he loved, and in doing so, he had become the very person he hated most, his father. I can't take it back, Min-jae said, his voice vibrating with a new, terrifying resolve. I can't fix the 4 years I stole from you. But I am done playing God, Keisha. I am done being a coward. As if punctuated by his words, a loud, aggressive thud echoed from the street-level door above. A heavy boot against wood. Then another. The untouchables, or perhaps a messenger from Harin, it didn't matter. The world he had tried to keep separate was finally crashing down into the basement. Min-jae stepped in front of Keisha, his hand moving to the small of his back where his weapon rested. The time for protection through distance was over. If he was the enemy who had broken her, he would be the monster who tore the world apart to put her back together. The aggressive thudding at the street-level door wasn't the sound of an assassin, but it felt just as lethal. It was the rhythmic, authoritative knock of the state. Keisha's face went a ghostly shade of ash, her hands flying to her mouth to stifle a gasp. In the corner, one of the triplets, little Zion, stirred, letting out a soft, confused whimper that cut through the tension like a blade. It's her, Keisha whispered, her voice trembling with a primal, visceral fear. The caseworker. She's early. Min-jae, you have to leave. If she sees a man like you here, if she sees the state of this place while you're standing in it, she'll take them. She'll say I'm unfit. Min-jae didn't move toward the back exit. Instead, he straightened his silk tie, the casual menace that usually defined him sharpening into a shield of absolute authority. He watched as the door at the top of the stairs creaked open. A woman in a sensible wool coat descended, followed closely by a man with a clipboard and a landlord whose face was a mask of greedy expectation. Ms. Robinson. The caseworker began, her voice clinical and cold as she stepped into the damp, cramped living space. Her eyes immediately cataloged the drying laundry, the crowded cribs, and the peeling wallpaper. We received an anonymous tip regarding the living conditions and the impending eviction. I'm here to determine if this environment meets the safety standards for 3 toddlers. The landlord stepped forward, his eyes landing on Min-jae with a flicker of confusion that quickly turned to bravado. She's behind on the rent, and the neighbors complain about the noise. I've already filed the paperwork. She's out by Friday. Keisha looked like she was about to shatter, her body vibrating with the effort to remain upright. But before she could speak, Min-jae stepped out of the shadows. The transition was seamless, the ghost of Soul Forest becoming the undisputed master of the room. He moved with a predatory grace, placing himself directly between the case worker and the cribs. There will be no eviction, Min-jae said, his voice a low, vibrating baritone that commanded the air in the room to still. The landlord scoffed. And who are you? Her lawyer. Min-jae didn't answer with words. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a thick envelope, tossing it onto the scarred kitchen table. The sound of the heavy stack of high-denomination bills hitting the wood was deafening. That is the rent for the next 3 years, plus a premium for your immediate silence. You will sign the deed transfer Kyung-soo is currently preparing, or you will find out how uncomfortable life can become for a slumlord in my district. The landlord's mouth fell open, his eyes fixed on the cash. Min-jae didn't give him a second glance. He turned his focus to the caseworker, whose clinical mask was finally beginning to crack. My name is Kong Min-jae, he stated, stepping closer until the woman had to look up to meet his gaze. He gestured toward the triplets, his voice softening just enough to be terrifying. And you are mistaken about the living conditions. This was a temporary arrangement while my estate was being retrofitted for children. These aren't just toddlers in a redevelopment zone. They are the heirs to the Kong Syndicate. The room went deathly silent. Keisha's breath hitched, her eyes wide as she realized what he was doing. By claiming them publicly, he wasn't just saving them from a case file. He was painting a target on their backs that only he could defend. I am the father, Min Jae continued, his hand coming to rest on the edge of Zion's crib as the boy reached up to grab his finger. The touch was electric, a tiny, warm connection that made the Shadow King feel more human than he had in a decade. And as of this moment, any further investigation into Ms. Robinson's fitness will be handled by my legal team. I believe your business here is concluded. The caseworker stammered, her clipboard trembling as she looked from the pile of cash to the man whose face was a regular fixture in the financial and crime sections of the evening news. She nodded once, a sharp, jerky movement, and beat a hasty retreat up the stairs, the landlord scurrying behind her like a rat following a scent. As the door clicked shut, the silence returned, heavier than before. Keisha looked at the money on the table, then at the man who had just dismantled her life to save it. You shouldn't have done that, she whispered, though she didn't move away when he stepped toward her. You just told the world who they are. You just brought the war to their doorstep. No, Min Jae said, his eyes reflecting the dim light of the basement with a new, fierce clarity. I just told the war that I'm finally standing on the doorstep. Get the children ready, Keisha. We're going home. The transition from the damp, suffocating shadows of the Itaewon basement to the sterile, marble-cold brilliance of the Kong estate felt like a fever dream. Keisha sat on the edge of a velvet-upholstered chaise longue in the guest wing, her hands gripped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were the color of bone. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the manicured gardens of the estate stretched out like a meticulously planned kingdom, guarded by high stone walls and men in black suits who moved with the silent lethality of ghosts. This was the Golden Cage. Min Jae stood by the arched doorway, his silhouette a sharp, dark line against the ivory-painted hallway. He had shed his suit jacket, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, but even in his relative state of undress, he radiated a casual menace that made the air in the room feel heavy. He watched as Zion, Isla, and Liam crawled across the thick, cream-colored rug, the first time their small hands had ever touched something so soft, yet the luxury felt like a threat. The children have their own suite adjacent to this one, Min Jae said, his voice a low, vibrating baritone that seemed to echo off the high ceilings. The kitchen is stocked. There is a pediatrician on call who will be here at dawn to see Isla. You won't have to work another night shift, Keisha. You won't have to count one for medicine. Keisha looked up at him, her eyes dark and hollowed by a cocktail of gratitude and resentment. Is that what you think this is? A fair trade? My freedom for your high-end healthcare. She stood up, the sheer scale of the room making her feel smaller than she ever had in the basement. I'm here because you put a target on their backs the moment you flashed that cash. I'm here because I have no other choice. Don't mistake my presence for forgiveness. Min Jae flinched, a microscopic twitch of his jaw that was the only outward sign of the blow she had landed. He stepped into the room, the scent of expensive tobacco and rain following him. The forced proximity was a suffocating pressure. In the basement, they were separated by their history, but here, in the vastness of his empire, they were trapped by his presence. I don't expect forgiveness, he replied, stopping just short of her personal space. The tension between them was a physical thing, a jagged wire pulled taut. I expect you to survive. And I expect my children to grow up in a world where they aren't breathing in mold. Your children, she spat, the words a bitter challenge. You don't even know how to hold them. You don't know that Liam needs to be patted on the back for 10 minutes after he eats, or he won't sleep. You don't know that Isla cries when it's too quiet because she's used to the sound of the street. Min Jae looked at the triplets, then back at Keisha. The vertical tattoo on his neck throbbed, a dark mark of the life he led, a life that was now pressing in on the woman he had tried to erase. He wanted to reach out, to bridge the 5 feet of expensive carpet between them, but he knew that any touch would be seen as a claim of ownership. He was the Shadow King, and in this house, his every whim was law. To Keisha, he wasn't a partner, he was a warden. "Then teach me," Min-jae said, his voice dropping to a rasp that was almost a plea. Keisha turned away, walking toward the window to watch the guards patrol the perimeter. She saw the flash of the moonlight on their weapons and felt the weight of the golden cage settling over her shoulders. She was safe, and the children were fed, but she had traded the freedom of the dark for a spotlight in a den of wolves. "I'll teach you how to be a father, Min-jae," she whispered, her reflection in the glass looking back at him with a haunting clarity. "But I won't teach you how to be mine again. You stay in your wing. I stay in mine. We are here for them, and only them." The silence that followed was broken only by the soft, rhythmic breathing of the toddlers. Min-jae stood in the center of the room, a man who owned half the city but couldn't buy a single inch of the woman standing 5 feet away. The high-tension piece of the estate had begun, and as the clock on the mantel ticked toward midnight, Min-jae realized that the hardest war he would ever fight wouldn't be on the streets. It would be in the quiet, echoing hallways of his own home. The air in the chairman's study was thick with the scent of old paper and cold ambition. Min-jae stood before the massive mahogany desk, his posture a rigid line of defiance against the weight of 1,000 years of tradition. His father, Chairman Kong, sat in the shadows, his face a landscape of deep-set wrinkles and eyes that had seen too many men die for the sake of the family name. Beside him stood Harin, her composure a sharp, brittle porcelain that looked ready to shatter at the slightest vibration. "You've been distracted, Min-jae," the chairman began, his voice a dry rasp that carried the authority of an absolute monarch. "Harin tells me you've brought guests into the estate. A charity project from the slums." "They aren't guests, father," Min-jae said, his voice dropping into a register that made the glass decanters on the sideboard hum. He didn't look at Harin, though he could feel her gaze burning into the side of his neck. "And they aren't a project. They are my blood. My children." The silence that followed was a physical blow. Harin's breath hitched, a small, sharp sound of redirected fury. "Your blood? With that woman? The one from the park?" She stepped forward, the 5-carat diamond on her hand flashing like a warning beacon. "You would humiliate me, Min-jae. You would humiliate the Kim family for a common runaway and 3 bastard children." "Watch your tongue, Harin," Min-jae warned, his casual menace finally sharpening into a lethal edge. He turned to her, his eyes cold as the Han River in winter. "They are my heirs. And as of this moment, there will be no wedding. The alliance is over. You are breaking a blood oath," the chairman growled, standing up with a slow, ominous grace. He slammed his palms onto the desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "You are trading the stability of this syndicate, the safety of our ports, and the Kim merger for a foreign girl and 3 half-breed mistakes? I didn't raise a fool, Min-jae. I raised a king. Then you should have taught the king that his kingdom is worth nothing if he has to murder his own soul to keep it," Min-jae countered, stepping into his father's personal space. The vertical tattoo on his neck throbbed. The mark of the monster his father had created, now turned against its maker. "I spent 4 years playing the coward for you. I let her starve while I sat at your table. That ends today." Harin's face contorted, her aristocratic mask finally falling away to reveal the predatory malice beneath. "You think you can just walk away? My father will pull every contract. The ports will close. Your rivals will know you've grown soft for a black girl and her brats. They'll tear this estate down with you inside it." "Let them try," Min-jae said, a grim, terrifying smile touching his lips. He pulled the engagement ring from his pocket, the one he had carried like a lead weight, and placed it on the desk. "If the Kim family wants war, they can find me at the front gate. But if so much as a shadow falls across the guest wing, I won't just break the alliance. I will burn the Kim empire to the ground and salt the earth." The chairman looked at his son, seeing for the first time a man he could no longer control. He didn't see weakness. He saw a new, unpredictable kind of strength. A man who had found a reason to fight, that was more powerful than greed. You are declaring war on your own blood, the chairman whispered. No, Min-jae replied, turning toward the door without a backward glance. I'm finally protecting it. He walked out of the study, the sound of Harin's shattered sob and his father's muffled curse fading behind him. He had broken the blood oath, but for the first time in his life, he felt clean. As he moved down the hallway toward the guest wing, he knew the war was coming, and the city would soon realize that a monster with something to love was the most dangerous creature of all. The transition from declaring war on a criminal empire to managing a nursery was a shift in gravity that Min-jae was fundamentally unprepared for. He stood in the center of the guest wing's morning room, his silk shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows, looking at a bowl of mashed peas as if it were a complex explosive device. In his world, problems were solved with a phone call, a signature, or a weapon. None of those tools worked on Zion, who was currently staring at Min-jae with a look of profound, toddler-sized skepticism. Min-jae attempted to apply tactical logic. He reasoned that if he approached the high chair with the same measured authority he used in boardrooms, the child would naturally comply. Zion, he began, his voice dropping into a low, commanding baritone. The nutritional value of this meal is essential for your growth. Open your mouth. Zion blinked once, then with the lightning-fast speed of a syndicate assassin, swiped the spoon. Green puree sprayed across Min-jae's cheek and the pristine white wall behind him. Keisha, leaning against the doorframe with a cup of coffee, let out a sound that was dangerously close to a laugh, the first spark of genuine amusement he had seen in 4 years. Tactical logic doesn't work on 3-year-olds, Min-jae. They don't care about your stature. I am observing a significant lack of discipline, Min-jae muttered, wiping a smear of pee from his jaw. He looked genuinely bewildered. He could navigate a 3-way turf war without breaking a sweat, but the chaotic variable of a messy toddler was dismantling his Shadow King persona piece by piece. Determined to succeed, he pivoted to the next objective, Liam. The boy had been fussy since dawn, and according to Min-jae's newly acquired fatherhood protocol, a stack of child psychology books he had ordered Kyung-soo to summarize into bullet points. The solution was a controlled sensory environment. He picked Liam up, holding him with the stiff, awkward caution of a man carrying a live grenade. He began to pace the room in a rhythmic, military-precise gait. He needs to be patted, Min-jae, Keisha said, her voice softening as she watched him struggle. Not marched. The books suggest rhythmic motion to simulate the womb, Min-jae countered, though his brow was furrowed in intense concentration. The books don't know my son. Keisha walked over, her presence bringing the scent of vanilla and warmth into his space. She didn't take the child. Instead, she placed her hand over Min-jae's large, scarred one, guiding it to the small of Liam's back. Gentle, rhythmic thumps. Like a heartbeat, not a drum. The touch was electric. Min-jae froze, his breath hitching as her palm pressed against the back of his hand. It was the first time they had touched without the friction of an argument or the weight of a tragedy. For a moment, the golden cage vanished, and they were just two people in the quiet morning light. Under her guidance, Min-jae softened. His rigid shoulders relaxed, and his hand found the right rhythm. Liam's crying faded into a soft, contented sigh, and the boy buried his face into the crook of Min-jae's neck. The cold, Mafia boss felt a terrifying, liquid warmth spread through his chest, a sensation far more dangerous than any threat his father could pose. He looked at Keisha, and for the first time, the ice in her gaze wasn't freezing him out. It was melting. "You're a mess," she whispered, reaching up to pick a stray piece of pee from his hair. Her fingers lingered for a fraction of a second too long near the vertical tattoo on his neck. The most feared man in Seoul, defeated by a spoon. "I am out of my depth," Min-jae admitted, a genuine self-deprecating smile finally breaking through his mask of granite. It wasn't the smile of a boss. It was the smile of a man who realized that his power meant nothing if he couldn't soothe a crying child. Keisha looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the man beneath the suit, the one who was willing to look ridiculous, to be covered in food and spit up, just to earn a moment of peace for them. The wall between them didn't fall, but a brick was removed. "Go wash your face, Minjae," she said, her voice a low, melodic hum. "I'll handle the peas. But when you come back, Zion wants to see if you can be a horse." Minjae looked at the floor, then at his expensive trousers, and finally at the laughing boy in the high chair. The transition from boss to father was messy, humbling, and utterly illogical. He loved it. The stillness of the estate's private balcony was a deceptive contrast to the storm gathering at the gates. Below, the shadows of armed men shifted among the hedges. Guards Minjae had doubled after the confrontation with his father. But up here, the air only carried the scent of night-blooming jasmine and the faint, distant hum of the city. Keisha stood by the railing, her silhouette a study in exhaustion and resilience. Minjae approached her, but he didn't use the silent, predatory stride of the Shadow King. He walked heavily, his presence heralded by the soft scuff of his shoes on the stone. He stopped a respectful distance away, his hands empty, his posture stripped of its habitual command. "The Kim family has begun pulling their investments," he said quietly, looking out at the skyline. "And my father has frozen the primary accounts. We are officially on our own." Keisha didn't turn. "You say that as if you expect me to be impressed by the sacrifice. You're still talking about money, Minjae. You're still talking about logistics and territory." She finally looked at him, her eyes reflecting the cold moonlight. "You think that by burning your world down, you've paid the bill. But I don't care about your syndicate, and I don't care about your war." Minjae felt the sharp, familiar sting of his own inadequacy. For years, he had operated on the logic of protection through distance and redemption through provision. He had bought the building, cleared the debts, and offered her a palace. He had treated her heart like a business ledger that could be balanced with enough zeros. "You're right," he whispered. The admission felt like a physical weight leaving his chest. He stepped closer, abandoning the safety of his cold, tactical distance. "I've spent my life thinking that if I controlled the variables, I could control the outcome. I thought if I provided for you, I didn't have to face you." He looked down at his hands, then back at her. The vertical tattoo on his neck, the brand of his father's world, seemed to fade in the vulnerability of the moment. "I told myself I left you at that bus station to save your life. And maybe, on some level, that was true. But the deeper truth, the truth I was too much of a coward to admit, was that I was afraid. I was afraid that if I chose you, I wouldn't know how to be the man you deserved. I was afraid of the weakness that loving you gave me." Keisha's breath hitched, her defensive posture softening by a fraction of an inch. "I played God because I was too small to be a man," Minjae continued, his voice cracking. "I stole 4 years of your life, not just because of my father, but because I was a coward who chose the safety of my own coldness over the risk of being yours. Money won't fix that. This estate won't fix that." He took the final step into her space, and, for the first time, he didn't reach for her with the intent to claim. He lowered his head, a gesture of absolute submission she had never seen from him. "I am sorry, Keisha," he said, the words raw and unadorned. "I am sorry for every night you spent in that basement. I am sorry for every breath Isla had to struggle for because I wasn't there. I am sorry for being the monster you had to survive. I don't deserve your trust, and I certainly don't deserve your love. But I am here, without the logic and without the lies. Just me." The silence stretched between them, thick with the ghosts of the last 4 years. Keisha looked at the man who had once been her entire world, then her greatest enemy, and now stood before her as something entirely new, a man seeking a second chance. She didn't fall into his arms, and she didn't promise that the wounds were healed. But she reached out, her fingers grazing the back of his hand, the same hand that had learned to pat Liam's back just hours before. "It's a start, Minjae," she whispered, her voice a fragile bridge across the canyon between them. "The money and the safety, that's for the children. But the truth? That was for me." As the first distant sound of a siren wailed from the city below, a signal that the war he had invited was finally arriving, Minjae didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He stood with the woman he loved, finally understanding that the greatest power he possessed wasn't the empire he was losing, but the family he was finally brave enough to claim.